The world today can sometimes be described as Eastern and Western civilizations, the realm of liberalism and democracy in the West, tyranny and oppression in the East. It probably doesn't need to be spelled out, but this is an extremely generalized and fairly inaccurate oversimplification of reality. Even in more advanced breakdowns of civilizations and how they interact with one another, we still often find generalizations or oversimplifications, and propositions of a broadly Western civilization which can range from understandable estimates to overly enthusiastic proportions. The same of so-called notions of Islamic civilization or a Pan-African civilization, often described in such estimates. Now, I've read arguments that the justification for the West, Christendom, or the Islamic world being categorized as they are is because they constitute a point at which two populations are utterly alien to one another, and the problem with that is that following this logic and definition, you could actually lump Christendom and the Islamic Ummah into one civilization, calling it Abrahamic Civilization, as they share religious lore, scriptural foundation, sacred figures, core values, and historic sites. Hindu civilization would be alien to that. Shainism, Shintoism, and Tengrism would be alien to that, but there are very clear distinctions between Christian and Islamic society which would lead us to recognize that these are not one single civilization or macroculture. By extension, the concept of a Western civilization and an Islamic civilization remains still too broad for me to say absolutely that these are all one people. To define civilization, we need to look deeper. Look to Europe, for instance, and it's no coincidence that among the populations most receptive to the Catholic faith are the Latin peoples, that those most receptive to the Orthodox faith are the Slavic peoples, and that those who led the Reformation and became the bastions of Protestantism were the Germanic peoples. Exceptions existed, of course, most especially in those states where faith became deeply entangled in national identity, see Austria, Poland, and Ireland. Keep in mind, Ireland was converted fairly early, while Poland and Austria were converted some centuries later. And of course, for the Orthodox, there's the Greeks, who were historically responsible for first introducing Orthodoxy to the Slavs. But even for regions like England, which was Christianized twice, mind you, once before and once after the Anglo-Saxon invasions, even despite early conversion, there was a strong shift toward Protestantism, and even then, not the same strain of Protestantism adopted on mainland Europe. By and large, we see a clear and identifiable trend of peoples and faiths, cultures and values, culminating in the formation of what we can call civilizations. Likewise with the Middle East, where Arab civilization became distinctly Sunni, while Persian civilization followed the path of Shi'ism. Even within the Sunni Arab world, you find key distinctions in the jurisprudence and theology. Often the importance of these distinctions is shrugged off, even within Islamic circles, and they can't be blamed for that. It's part of their faith to not divide the Ummah, the Islamic world. But when speaking of differing interpretations of theology and jurisprudence, you're effectively talking about different interpretations of the nature of faith and how the faith should be carried out in law and politics. You look at the Arab Sunnis of the Maghreb, and there where Berber cultural influence and the geographic nature and isolation of the region influences cultural development, you find a distinct school of jurisprudence and homogeneity around a school of theology distinct from that of Arabia or the more theologically diverse lands of the Levant. And this is simply within Sunnism alone. Suffice to say, there's more complexity to global civilizations than merely the West, the Muslims, the Africans, and the Chinese. And in today's video, we'll be going over every major civilization in the world, and I say major because the world is a big place, and there's bound to be some smaller groups that we'll risk glossing over. We'll also be glossing over smaller states with limited reach and hybridized cultures that could easily fit into one category or another. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this on history and politics every week, although recently we've been missing a few weeks. We've been out traveling, and I'm still traveling as of making this video, but we will be returning to our normal schedule very soon. So if you enjoy this kind of thing, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. The first civilization we'll discuss, and the first of what some may call the Western civilizations, are the Latins. Occupying Western European lands corresponding to the borders of the old Western Roman Empire, the Latins, as the name suggests, have been heavily influenced by the ancient Latin culture, which remains clear to see even in their modern languages. They are heavily influenced by the Roman Catholic Church and the legacy of the Roman Republic and Western Empire. Governance and society in this civilization has always been more top-down, hierarchical, and centralized, drawing upon the church structure which shapes the value system of this people, as well as the ancient traditions of the Latins. Though that being said, when social contracts break down, the Latins are quick to adapt and even radical in response, but struggle to establish lasting equilibrium. Take, for instance, the instability of the French Revolution and the series of republics, kingdoms, and empires which followed, the long economic crisis which plagued imperial Spain, and the emergence of organized crime within Italy to combat banditry and enforce order when the government failed to. It's likely the reason for this is that the long reliance on top-down government leads many to the mindset that someone else will solve the problems because that's how the system always worked, but especially in times where the upper authority is crippled or faltering, nothing is getting done. And of course, when things get bad enough, that's when radicalism kicks in and strongman figures fill the void, sometimes restoring order, other times tumbling before a lasting solution can be achieved. The idea of Western Rome continues to paint this civilization's vision of its future, as recently as Napoleon angling to unify Europe under an imperial dynasty, and arguably even today seeing France continue much the same through the development of the EU. Next up we have the Germanic Civilization, encompassing some of the last lands in Europe to be fully Christianized and being among those most heavily influenced by the Germanic culture and language. The influence of Catholicism, while once large and present, never fully took root in these lands as it had elsewhere. Arguably, the enthusiasm these lands felt for the Reformation had less to do with a wholehearted commitment to Lutheranism or Calvinism, and more in opposition to the authority and culture of the Catholic Church. This is reinforced by the fact that Germanic Austria, while also among the lands to be Christianized a bit later, had fully embraced Roman Catholic institutions as a source of political authority and entangled them into its culture in a way the lands of North Germany never did. Like for the Latins, the culture and faith of the Germanics significantly enforced their governing and social structure, less dependent upon imperial-style hierarchy, more focused on tribal consensus, local autonomy, decentralized decision-making, that sort of thing. There was less a sense of enforced order from a leader and more an emphasis on the individual as a moral agent and enforcement of social order by the local community. Pair this with a heavy emphasis upon scripture rather than church authority, and individual actions become far more prominent a feature of Germanic conduct. As a result, Germanic civilization can be either industrious in times of stability or militant in times of crisis, contributing to the stereotypes of both the Protestant work ethic and the Germanics historically being a warlike people. Unfortunately, this tendency toward militarism has historically led the Germanics to exacerbate times of crisis on the continent, lashing out violently in an effort to restabilize themselves. The English civilization takes us beyond just Europe to populations in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, areas where the culture cooked up in the British Isles was thoroughly transplanted with minimal alteration, making them near identical extensions of the civilization found in Britain. English civilization was the product of amalgamation by several populations: the Celts, the Romans, the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Vikings, and Normans. All of those populations contributed to carving out a distinct English society which was not merely derivative of Germanic civilization, but something new altogether, a reality that was furthered by the population's isolation on the British Isles, and long identity struggle against France contributing to a cultural genesis. The local and tribal law of the Angles and Saxons was consolidated and organized under the Normans into what would eventually be reformed into the basis of English common law. This is important because it preserved top-down authority while creating a bottom-up structure. This contributed to both a society of uniformity and order, but also the importance of reason, debate, and increasingly civilian participation in the legal process, which over time would evolve into English-style democracy. As English identity became better defined, the English kings increasingly chafed under the authority of the Catholic Church, and well before Henry VIII began pressing for greater autonomy and control over religion. Unlike continental Protestants, the English did not reject the structure of the Church, but its authority as a foreign entity, and so maintained an Episcopalian structure, but placed the king at the head of the Church over the Pope, asserting an otherness from continental Christendom distinct from the Latins, Germanics, and Slavs. While characterized by its language and Anglican tradition, English civilization is ultimately rooted in a distinctive ideological framework: reverence for the rule of law, individual liberty, and moral reason. It also carries that persistent sense of cultural distinctiveness, often expressed as superiority, whether of a cultural or moral variety, which has historically driven it to export its values to others under the banner of improvement, order, or development. This mentality of, if we intervene or invade you, it's for your own good, because we know better. Greek civilization holds ancient roots, from the constellation of city-states to the heights of the Macedonian Empire and the grandeur of East Rome. But territorial heights are more a sense of pride for the Latins. For the Greeks, what's most valuable to them are the civilizational advancements they carried out and continue to carry under their belt: philosophy, mathematics, architecture, and politics. And many of those ancient Hellenistic traditions worked their way into the dominant Orthodox faith of this civilization, with early church fathers and religious scholars adapting the theories of Plato and Aristotle to frame Christian theology. The nature of the church gives Greek civilization a firm conservatism and stubbornness, resistant to change as per orthodoxy. Like the Latins and the influence of the Catholic Church, orthodoxy gives Greek civilization a strong sense of collectivism and community, as faith adopts a more communal rather than personal character. After the fall of Byzantium, the church acted as a shelter for Greek culture and tradition, preserving and ultimately allowing it to resurface centuries later. Polish civilization, while arguably an offshoot of Latin civilization as well as Slavic civilization, has characteristics and divergence points which can justifiably classify it as its own entity. The influence of Polish civilization does not stop at the borders of modern Poland, but reaches into the lands of Lithuania and Ukraine, largely corresponding to parts of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, though influence in areas like Belarus, Latvia, and Estonia has waned. Catholicism acted as a crucial shaper of Polish identity, having served to legitimize ruling nobles and protected Polish identity when it came under threat, and it's in that threat Poland faces that it finds another driver of its identity. The threat posed by Russia historically has served to strengthen Polish civilizational identity and deepens its bonds with states also fearful of Russian conquest like Lithuania, who because of Poland's influence remains the sole Baltic state with a strong religious identity. Ukraine, though only a portion of it has historic Polish influence, has also gravitated closer to Poland as it has pulled away from Russia. On that note, Russian civilization finds its roots in the emergence of the Kievan Rus and its eventual adoption of orthodoxy. On one hand, Russian civilization sees itself as the leader of the Slavic world, and arguably we might say that the Slavic world, especially the South Slavic world, is merely an extension of Russian civilization. While on the other hand, through its Orthodox background and historic ties to the Byzantine Empire, Russia views itself as a third Rome. Shaped by its experience under Mongolian authority, its harsh winters, and the struggle of unifying and forging a Russian state gave Russian civilization a fatalistic outlook, that the world is cold and unforgiving. Orthodoxy for the Russians only reinforced this outlook as it made the difficulties and injustices of life understandable, that this would pale in comparison to the peace and paradise of what was promised in the next life. This all culminated in a firm endurance among the Russians, but, like the Greeks, also a stubbornness and resistance to change. Shaping Russian civilization's outlook is also its geography. The Mongols had exploited the steppe corridor to press into Russian lands bypassing the defensive Ural Mountains, and further incursions from the west, including from Poland-Lithuania, would take advantage of the Eurasian plain to press into Russia's heartland. This put Russian civilization on the defensive and drove it to make strategic territorial acquisitions to fortify its security from outside incursions. Let's take a break right here. If you've enjoyed this content so far, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and ask you to give us a like. We're aiming to hit 300,000 subscribers by the end of the summer, which for me is late September, so every little bit helps as we get closer to that deadline. American civilization is an offshoot of English civilization, but one which took to diverging from the motherland almost immediately, seeing settlement by a myriad of differing Christian and cultural groups during a time of great change overseas, and with ample space, time, and freedom, those populations rather than integrate only developed further, producing a much more pluralistic society, but one still united nevertheless by a sense of otherness, uniqueness, more exceptionalism than anything else, as well as an almost sacred unifying mythos surrounding the founders and the constitution of the country. Effectively, American civilization emerged in a similar fashion to English civilization, only on a grander, more accelerated scale. Not just an isolated island, but an isolated continent populated by groups with dramatically differing interpretations of their faith, culture, and values. The prevalence of the Baptists alone, of which there are more than in all of Europe combined 10 times over, their distinct practice and its influence on American, namely Southern culture, has contributed to reshaping America's civilizational landscape. American civilization, though it shares much with its English predecessor, is distinguished by its more pluralistic character, its aversion to centralized order, be it monarchical, ecclesiastical, or bureaucratic, as well as its near-religious devotion to the ideals of liberty and self-governance, most especially within the context of a federated system, which itself is a recognition of its pluralistic nature and the need to provide federated autonomy to its varying populations. There is also, in spite of the Cold War shift, a general aversion to foreign entanglement, further distinguishing it from its more assertive English progenitor. Latin American civilization, like the American civilization, is an offshoot, but of Latin origin. While the American civilization is more defined by its pluralism, the Latin American civilization bore witness to a synthesis of Iberian and indigenous Amerindian culture which, despite its relative cultural homogeneity, stratified fiercely along class and caste lines, which themselves were shaped by Iberian perspectives of race and ethnicity. Tragically, the civilization has been defined in great part by exploitation, which continues to define the economic circumstances of the countries which comprise it. Used primarily by Spain and Portugal for resource extraction and receiving little investment in return, the Latin American civilization has grown accustomed to serving as a resource and agriculture exporter, heavily dependent upon wealthier societies to help it get by. This background of exploitation has effectively stunted this civilization's growth, fed cycles of corruption, and left it in a state of arrested development, contributing to a major split in its quality of life from region to region, seeing some enjoy standards reminiscent to those in Latin Europe, while others, whether integrated or more culturally Amerindian, lag far behind. Saudi civilization is defined by its strict adherence to Islamic law from a firmly scripturalist perspective and is shaped predominantly by nomadic tribal culture indigenous to the Arabian Desert and the later introduction of Hanbalist thought. Despite Islam's initial emergence from Arabia, the west coast opposite the origin of Saudi Arabia specifically, power quickly centered itself upon the north urban hubs of the Levant and Mesopotamia, leaving Arabia proper to stagnate, which, along with the light Hellenization of the northern Islamic populations, would make the Arabs of southern Arabia particularly receptive to Hanbali thought, which aimed to purge outside innovations and remain true to Islamic scripture, and would be brought to prominence in the region by the Saudis. Saudi civilization sees itself as the purest and truest manifestation of Arab Islamic culture, and holds ambitions of gaining sufficient prominence through economic means to shape the Middle East in its image. Hanbalist scripturalism shapes Saudi civilization to the point that the state of Saudi Arabia has foregone the notion of a constitution and simply holds the Quran as its state constitution. This leaves little room for human reason or innovation and makes the civilization remarkably firm in its stubbornness. That being said, Saudi civilization has always been one that had to make do with less. This has changed significantly in modern times as their oil economy has become more prominent and contributing almost to a culture of excess. Levantine Arab civilization is defined by its historic proximity to and conquest of major Greek settlements, exposure to Hellenistic culture inspired within the Levantine Arabs a fascination with science, mathematics, and philosophy. Naturally, this led many Levantines to place higher emphasis on human reason in matters of theology and jurisprudence, creating a society that was more modernized than their neighboring counterparts. Their position at the intersection of the three old world continents also fueled a more mercantile society exposed to more foreign influences, giving them a somewhat cosmopolitan character, while the level of development in this region tended to leave the civilization at the heart of and more directly administered by the ruling caliphates of the day, creating an inclination toward government order, structure, and centralized leadership. Maghrebi Civilization is defined by its amalgamation of Arab-Berber culture and has molded their jurisprudence off the practices of the four rightly guided caliphs and those of the city of Medina during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Like the Saudi civilization, the Arab civilization of the Maghreb is relatively more isolated in their interior lands, but maintain major coastal settlements which serve as hubs for the decentralized inland. This location had put the Maghrebis in a prime location to engage in the slave trade, gathering slaves from the Sahel region of Africa or from raiding settlements across Europe, which would eventually contribute to retaliation and colonization by Europe and the lingering influence of Napoleonic law upon the legal codes of the Maghreb states, giving them a unique degree of European influence that was imposed rather than adopted like it was in the Levantine states. Persian civilization persists as one of the oldest in the world. Rooted in Zoroastrian concepts of order rivaling chaos, this perspective was adopted into Persia's distinctive Shiite style of Islam, preserving the Magi system through the enhanced role of imams when compared to Sunnism, or the maintaining of the Zoroastrian concept of a savior or Soshiant who will arrive and destroy evil, a concept which is basically identical to the Shia concept of the 12th imam serving as the Mahdi who will fulfill the exact same role. The Persian experience has ebbs and flows, struggling to reassert a role of prominence for themselves in a region they have become very alien to. Locked between Sunni Arabs to the west and Sunni Pashtuns to the east, Persia is isolated but eager to prove itself as a leader. Turkish Civilization is an offshoot of Turkic Civilization, which we'll get to momentarily, and the product of synthesis between Byzantine political infrastructure, Turkic nomadic culture, and Levantine religious theology. Having first worked their way into the Middle East through a domination of Persia and the Abbasid Caliphate, the incursions of the Mongol Empire would sufficiently destabilize the region for the Turks to eventually conquer Byzantine lands and establish a caliphate which would give them a presence in Europe, Asia, and Africa. The role of caliphate would impress upon the Turkish civilization a sense of grandeur, while occupation of Byzantine land brought the Turks much wealth and exposed them to later European innovations, semi-westernizing the Turks on a level that wasn't seen since the Arabian conquests of Greek lands. But as time wore on, the Turks struggled to maintain their caliphate, and ever since the fall of their fragile empire, have aspired to regain that prestige through military might as they had before. Unlike the centralized Turkish civilization, the Turkic civilization is characterized by a pattern of charismatic leaders and warlords, ephemeral empires, and loosely centralized pastoral steppe society. Islam was introduced into the region, amalgamating with the shamanistic faith of Tengrism, and since the end of Soviet rule, the Turkic civilization has secularized significantly, with only the cultural influence of Islam really remaining layered over the confederated clan-oriented society. While Indonesia can be described as a pluralistic civilization akin to the United States, its deeper structure more closely resembles the civilizational models of India or Russia. Diverse, yes, but cohered by a dominant cultural nucleus. That nucleus is the Javanese, who serve as the civilization's culture-shaping force. Java is the demographic, political, and cultural heart of Indonesia, home to the capital, the largest population, and the ideological blueprint that binds the archipelago together. The foundational ideology of the Indonesian state, Pancasila, or maybe it's Pancasila, I've only read it in books, articulates 5 core tenets: belief in one God, a just and civilized society, democracy through representation, social justice, and most importantly, Indonesian unity. More than a constitutional doctrine, this ideology functions as the skeletal structure of Indonesian civilization, enforcing cohesion in a nation of over 17,000 islands and hundreds of ethnic groups. While Indonesia is the world's most populous Muslim-majority country, Islam in Java has been deeply hybridized with older belief systems. The Islam practiced by most Javanese blends Islamic concepts with Hindu-Buddhist cosmology, ancestral veneration, and animist rituals, forming a distinctly syncretic religious culture. Only about 20% of Indonesia's Muslims adhere to a more scripturalist or orthodox Islam. Javanese, or we might just say Indonesian civilization, is defined by its civilizational diplomacy. It aims to absorb diverse traditions and smooth them over into one single entity. Though, of course, this is done with Javanese culture as the shaping hands. Hindu civilization is probably best characterized by its belief in Dharma, a type of cosmic order that goes beyond spirituality to structuring society itself. Every individual, according to this view, is born into a role with specific duties that reflect and sustain the balance of the universe. In practice, this manifests as the caste system, where social stratification is not merely political or economic, but divinely ordained. This worldview provides clarity and order to an otherwise chaotic reality. It assigns meaning, responsibility, and purpose, prescribing a path through life that maps one's duties, pleasures, material pursuits, and ultimate spiritual liberation. In doing so, it relieves existential ambiguity and fosters psychological resilience. What gives Hindu civilization its remarkable longevity is that this order is internalized, not enforced. It's not dependent on a centralized institution or a single text. The tradition is inherently decentralized and pluralistic. This is how a multitude of deities, rituals, and philosophical schools could emerge and coexist under this civilizational umbrella. Pakistani civilization emerged from the Indo-Islamic tradition brought by centuries of conquest and conversion, namely under the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire. But unlike other Islamic civilizations, Pakistan's civilizational identity is not merely a continuance of Islamic theology, but built around a deliberate and enduring rejection of Hindu civilization. The creation of Pakistan was less about theological purity than it was a civilizational divorce. The purpose of Pakistan was not simply to carve out a Muslim homeland, but to forge a civilization that could define itself in opposition to Indian pluralism, secularism, and Hindu cultural hegemony. This continues to shape Pakistani civilization in present times, as it's not merely Muslim, it is anti-Hindu, it is anti-Indian, and it's anti-pluralist. This rejection drives both its domestic culture and its foreign policy, aligning with Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia, while also cultivating ties with clear threats to India like China. Moving over to sub-Saharan Africa, we have a handful of civilizations worth bringing up. In the Horn of Africa, we find the Axomite Civilization, Africa's oldest surviving advanced civilization characterized by its largely Christian, specifically Oriental Orthodoxy faith, and its historic imperial organization. Maintaining cultural and religious autonomy even under pressure from surrounding Islamic empires and European colonialism, Axomite Civilization places extraordinary emphasis on divine kingship, sacred lineage, and religious orthodoxy, merging ancient Semitic traditions with African cultural foundations. Now, this being said, the Axomites find themselves in a similar isolated situation to Persia, identifying with neither sub-Saharan Africa nor with the Islamic Middle East, making them something all their own. Swahili Civilization developed along the East African coast through centuries of trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange between Bantus, Arabs, Persians, and Indians. This coastal character shaped it into a proper maritime and mercantile civilization, historically rooted in Islamic faith but recently converted to Christianity, leaving it with broad Abrahamic values as Islam and Christianity both continue to play major roles in Swahili life. City-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar function as ports of exchange rather than imperial capitals, meaning political authority was often decentralized and dependent on trade relationships. Sahelian Civilization developed in the band just south of the Sahara, blending Berber, Islamic, and Sudanese influences into one overarching culture. Dominated historically by empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, Sahelian society combined Islamic statecraft with indigenous systems of caste, kinship, and animism. These early empires were trade empires, using their geography as a bridge between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, with trans-Saharan trade serving as the civilization's economic backbone. While Islamic institutions became prominent in urban centers like Timbuktu, they never fully erased local customs, which continued to shape the civilization's governance and ritual. Now, in Asia, Japanese civilization actually began through migration from the Korean peninsula, introducing rice cultivation and intermingling Korea's population with Japan's native Jomon inhabitants to create the modern Japanese ethnicity. This migration would be followed by the unification of Japan's tribes under the Yamato clan. The rise of clans gave structure to the spirit worship of the ancient Jomon people, forging the beginnings of Shintoism, attributing spiritual identities to natural phenomenon and interlacing this with ancestral worship to strengthen clan identity. Reverence for spirits would be joined by the additional affirmations of protecting tradition and family, loving nature, and maintaining of physical and spiritual cleanliness. Unlike China, Japan has always emphasized form over abstract philosophy. Japanese governance historically balanced militarism, imperial divinity, and bureaucratic competence, producing a disciplined, orderly, and patriotic society strongly isolated from the rest of Asia. Even following its interactions with the West, Japan has shown itself to be adaptive, whether with the Meiji Restoration or the adoption of Yoshida Doctrine, pivoting to an economic focus after World War II until it felt capable of reasserting military might. Han Civilization is arguably the longest-standing centralized political culture on Earth, the direct product of a cradle of civilization, an achievement only potentially rivaled by India, but whose line of continuity has been broken by the Aryan invasions. It is defined not by ethnicity alone, but by a deep-rooted worldview, order through hierarchy, and unity through assimilation. At its core is Confucian philosophy that structures society in a way where every individual has a role to fulfill. This would contribute to the development of strong bureaucratic infrastructure, meritocratic civil service, and dynastic cycles of rise, corruption, collapse, and renewal. Vietnamese civilization was significantly shaped by Chinese civilization and could arguably be considered an offshoot. It blends Confucian administrative tradition with an indigenous ethos of resistance and resilience. Governed for centuries under Chinese imperial influence, Vietnam adopted Chinese statecraft while maintaining a fiercely independent identity forged through repeated struggles against foreign domination. This produced a society that honors hierarchy and scholarship, but also romanticizes rebellion and moral defiance. Essentially, Vietnamese culture respects order, but not submission, and this has been a defining characteristic of the Vietnamese civilization ever since it gained independence from China. In some ways, it shares this characteristic with the United States. Theravada Civilization spans much of Southeast Asia and is shaped by a unique Buddhist political fusion, ruled by merit, not mandate. Kings are seen as protectors of the Dharma, and their legitimacy depends on their moral conduct and support for the faith's monastic order. Monasteries serve not just as religious centers, but as schools and informal courts, giving this civilization a light, theocratic character. Had it not been for Chinese influence, Vietnam may have found itself a part of this civilization, but 1,000 years of occupation will certainly have an effect. The scriptural language of Theravada, Pali, has also served as a bridge between the Buddhist peoples of Southeast Asia, not being used commonly but acting as a common religious tongue. Mongolian civilization is characterized by Tengrist cosmology and the later influence of Mantrayana Buddhist doctrine, and has long revolved around the concept of heavenly mandate, where legitimacy comes from success in war, harmony with nature, and the ability to provide for one's people. Leadership is not hereditary by default, but proven through charisma, strength, and wisdom. This ethos survives in Mongolia's modern nationalism, which venerates Genghis Khan not merely as a great conqueror, but as the spiritual and civilizational father of the country. Mongolian civilization entered a decline with Qing domination and Russian-Chinese partitioning of Mongol lands, leading to fragmentation between Outer Mongolia and Inner Mongolia, as well as other Mongol communities in Siberia and Central Asia. The later influences of communism would nearly wipe out traditional religion and nomadic life, with Mongolian civilization now leaning heavily upon the legacy of Genghis Khan as perhaps their last major rallying point of identity. Himalayan civilization, centered in Tibet and parts of the greater Himalayan region, is the most esoteric and spiritually centralized of Buddhist societies on account of its particular strain of Mantrayanan or Vajrayanan Buddhism, which incorporates a belief in spiritual techniques, rituals, visualization of deities, etc. It is defined by its integration of government and ritual, where political authority is fused with spiritual meaning, often embodied in the person of the Dalai Lama or other reincarnated lamas, and that's a fascinating aspect of this as well, that their political figures, rather than have power passed down through heredity, power is passed down through reincarnation. This civilization developed in extreme geographic isolation, producing a highly monastic and contemplative culture, and is legitimized through spiritual insight, not military or economic strength. While this tends to lead to relatively peaceful practice, it also means a lack of practical resilience. Thus, Himalayan civilization is prone to domination by external forces. Korean civilization shares Confucian roots with China, but expresses them with far greater emotional intensity and more absolutism. Deeply hierarchical and centered on education, family honor, and national identity, Korean society internalized Confucian order not as bureaucratic rationality, but as an ethical imperative. Where Chinese Confucianism leans toward pragmatic order, Korea forged an ethical iron cage for itself. At the same time, Korea grew in the shadow of much more powerful civilizations, China, Japan, the Mongols. It developed with a bit of a chip on its shoulder, proud yet perpetually besieged and put down. The result is a culture simultaneously inward-looking and hyper-defensive, and that reflects very much in Korea's modern situation, split between its north and its south. The north has taken Confucian absolutism and extracted from it a totalitarian cult of personality. The South, in contrast, liberalized but preserved its conformist society obsessed with status, education, and moral purity, arguably more defined by its opposition to North Korea than anything else. And there we have it, the some 27 major civilizations of the world. This took a bit longer than I expected, but let me know if there are any other major civilizations that you think we should have included. Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.